bountiful, innovative, entrepreneurial, diverse, progressive. Sick? Americans get sick more often than Europeans and people in other industrialized countries, and they're getting sicker. Since the mid-90s, the number of Americans suffering from at least 3 chronic illnesses nearly doubled, and America's international ranking for infant mortality and lifespan also plunged. There are many reasons why this is taking place. One may be right in front of you.
And zinc. As a result, the food is less nutritious. It's showing up in the animals, and glyphosate use is doing it, and it's following and working its way right up the food chain.
Those deficiencies are very well documented as being factors in animal diseases as well as in human diseases. You really need a balance of all the nutrition, all the nutrients, to keep this physical body really functioning in all the areas, because all of them are mutually supportive and interdependent.
Basically, if you had one trace mineral and you were looking at a specific disease, you would see an animal survive and respond to treatment, this type of thing. If you got 2 trace minerals that were deficient, you had a more virulent, in other words, a more aggressive disease pattern, even with the same identical disease. And when you got to the 3 elements that were severely deficient, then things really got serious. To the point that they probably wouldn't respond to treatment, and we'd have a very, very high death loss.
What do livestock in the United States eat? Roundup-ready crops. Roundup-ready soy, corn, cottonseed, canola meal, sugar beet pulp, and now alfalfa. The bulk of their diet is Roundup-ready crops. And those crops are nutrient deficient and have high concentrations of Roundup.
The glyphosate problem has a number of issues for us, and one of the very sad side effects of glyphosate are birth defects. In the towns where people were workers on the farm, particularly the soybean farms, we had as much as 70 times increase in the number of birth defects in these sprayed areas. And in fact, research of looking at studies around the world show that glyphosate is in fact genotoxic, which means it does directly cause birth defects. And that doesn't necessarily mean exposure directly to the body. In other words, the person was underneath the sprayer and got sprayed. So exposure can also be ingestion, because that is an exposure of the body to glyphosate.
Lab animals fed Roundup-ready soy have had serious reproductive disorders. In mice, the testicles changed, including damage to the young sperm cells. In rats, there were changes in the uterus and ovaries. The DNA functioned differently in the embryo offspring of mice. When female rats were fed genetically modified soy, more than half of their babies died within 3 weeks. The babies were also smaller and could not reproduce. When mice were fed genetically modified Roundup-ready and BT corn, they had fewer babies and smaller babies. Preliminary evidence that's not yet published can be even worse. In rats, the testicles changed from pink to blue. In hamsters, by the 3rd generation, most lost the ability to have babies. Some had hair growing in their mouths. This is astounding research, and yet it's never followed up. Typically, the industry distorts or denies the findings, pretending that there's no problem.
Where we used to have 1 fertility clinic for people, we now have an average of 14.
In our community and where I live, within 100 miles of my house, there's 50 infertility clinics. 20 years ago, there probably wasn't any. One of the ladies in our local community that works in a hairdressing shop where the ladies get to talking and this type of thing anyway, they just accept the fact that the to bring forth one healthy baby, and they may have 1, 2, 3, 4 miscarriages before they finally have one that takes. So what does that all mean long term? I don't know. It's scary. We just know that fertility is declining. There may be other reasons. I don't know the answer to that. But in the livestock world, we definitely know that there's a decline.
There's a virtual epidemic of reproductive disorders in the livestock in the U.S. Some veterinarians and scientists started examining the aborted fetal tissue of livestock that had miscarriages. And they found an organism that was new to science. It was tiny, the size of a virus, but it had some properties of a fungus. They had never seen it before.
We're still not quite sure what it is. We have the DNA now that's in the process of being analyzed, sequenced, so that we can put a name on it. So it's a very small entity. We know that it's fairly heat tolerant, but that it can cause reproductive failure.
In fact, they've taken the organism and exposed it to a pregnant chicken in a laboratory. And it killed the embryo within 48 hours.
Veterinarians have performed Koch's postulates, where they've isolated it from the animal or from fetal tissue. They can culture it in pure culture, reintroduce it to the animal, reproduce all of the symptoms, and then re-isolate it. That establishes a scientific basis that this is the organism or the entity causing the reproductive failure.
This new organism is in high concentrations of soy and corn products that have been sprayed with Roundup. In particular, it's in high concentrations on diseased plants where the diseases are known to be created by Roundup.
Had a producer northwest of the Twin Cities last year that called me and was losing calves to miscarriages, and some cows were dying. He was feeding his cows Roundup Ready corn silage sprayed with Roundup, so it's all GMO, and over the years he's drained the health of his cows down, and it's costing him calves now. And they have had the feed tested and the cows tested, and we're finding the deficiencies that are consistent with Dr. Huber's work. We had liver samples that were sent to a university and found they were all short on manganese, and we had feed samples sent out to a third party to get us into the testing lab for that organism, and it was loaded with the organism.
Secretary Vilsack, as governor of Iowa years earlier, was awarded Biotech Governor of the Year. He's now in charge of agriculture in the United States. Dr. Don Huber sent a letter to Secretary Vilsack describing this organism and describing it as an emergency.
I felt that it would be irresponsible for me as a scientist not to alert the Secretary of Agriculture to the serious nature of the situation as it was developing.
Dr. Huber wrote, "For the past 40 years, I have been a scientist in the professional and military agencies that evaluate and prepare for natural and man-made biological threats, including germ warfare and disease outbreaks. Based on this experience, I believe the threat we are facing from this pathogen is unique and of a high-risk status. In layman's terms, it should be treated as an emergency."
He asked the Secretary to hold off on the approval of Roundup Ready alfalfa, because that would increase the use of Roundup in the United States, and if Roundup were linked to this organism, it would pour fuel onto this fire. A few weeks after the letter was received, Huber got a call from the USDA, and he gave them the names of some scientists and veterinarians to talk to. 6 months later, they still hadn't been contacted. Unfortunately, the USDA is completely ignoring the problems with Roundup. They just approved Roundup Ready alfalfa in 2011, as well as Roundup Ready Kentucky bluegrass.
Let's review what we have so far. Genetic engineering transfers genes between species. The process itself creates mutations throughout the DNA, which can produce new allergens, toxins, and other nasties. The inserted genes and their proteins may trigger inflammation, which might promote numerous problems such as digestive disorders, allergies, diabetes, autoimmune disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, kidney disease, thyroid disease, and heart attacks. Genetically engineered BT corn produces an insecticide, which may break holes in our intestinal walls. If so, experts link gut permeability to allergies, autism, and premature aging, as well as other disorders such as autoimmune disease, cancer, asthma, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and others. Most GM plants are engineered to survive doses of Roundup herbicide. Roundup steals nutrients, which can lead to nutrient-deficient plants, animals, and humans. Roundup can also cause birth defects and other reproductive disorders. Lab animals that ate Roundup-ready crops lost a large number of offspring. Roundup is also linked to infertility, which may be from disrupted hormones, nutrient deficiency, or a brand new organism. FDA scientists had warned that GMOs were dangerous, but their boss was a Monsanto man. Monsanto sells Roundup and most GM seeds. The FDA doesn't require any studies and doesn't monitor any health issues linked to GMOs.
I've been writing a syndicated newspaper column called Animal Doctor for about 40 years. And it was in the late 1990s that I started receiving letters from several of my 25 to 30 million readers across the United States indicating that their dogs and cats were having various health problems that were not being treated by their veterinarians effectively. These problems were persisting. And when I advised them to switch the animal's diet to get rid of genetically engineered corn and soybean, and the animals started getting better, I have what I call evidence-based medicine that their health problems were most likely primarily being caused by genetically engineered corn and soybean, and possibly the Roundup herbicide glyphosate residue. And I have at least 40 to 60 letters on file testifying to these magical cures, which the veterinarians were missing. Many of these animals would be put on a special manufactured prescription diet for inflammatory bowel disease or skin allergies, you know, the poor dog just tearing itself to bits, or having diarrhea all over the place and everybody going nuts in the home. But still, they were not being cured because in a lot of these prescription diets were the same ingredients. The corn and the soy had been genetically engineered.
An agricultural consultant describes an experience he had with a client who was raising miniature steers on a hobby farm.
He was trying to be as organic as possible, and so he was feeding them a non-GMO corn. And he had run out of his corn, so he went to his supplier, and they didn't have anything but GMO corn. And so he started feeding his cattle GMO corn, and he said suddenly he noticed that his steers were having a lot of illness problem. They were getting really agitated, irritated. They just weren't the normal, calm, docile creatures he was used to. He said he lost about 90% of his miniature steers. What the problem was is, I guess he said that they weren't able to process the food correctly, and they would bloat up and die from it.
I've got my first major livestock producer that feeds about 5,000 head of cattle. He just made a transition here within the last year in my community.
A lot of trouble with cattle dying the longer you fed them genetically modified crop. The longer we'd feed them, the more deaths we would have. We wouldn't lose cattle the first 60 to 80 days on feed, and from then on we would start losing them 1 or 2 a week. And when we switched, the cattle have been a lot calmer, and we've had a lot less pneumonia and health issues since that time.
A farmer got a call from an excited friend who had recently switched to non-GMO corn for his large pig nursery.
I was surprised that he was so worked up. He was just stammering something terrible, trying to explain to me what he wanted to talk about.
The farmer said the pig's disease and medicine costs came way down. Feed intake went up, and the pigs were happier and more playful.
Actually, he says, we've seen things change on about the 3rd day. But he says, my brothers and I walked into barns and we were all admiring how things were a little different. And he says, we laughed. Well, it's probably that non-GMO corn. He says, we kind of chuckled about it. And he says, we kind of just wrote it off, but he says, we realize now that after 2 to 3 days, we started seeing that change. And he says, by the time I called you, which was day 11, he says, it was dramatic.
The family had been struggling with high disease rates for more than 12 years, ever since they introduced genetically modified corn. But it was only after they witnessed the recent improvement in their pigs' health and behavior that they realized the GM corn was the source of the problem. A pig farmer in Denmark switched to non-GMO soy in April 2011. Within 2 days, the piglet's serious and sometimes fatal diarrhea virtually disappeared. After switching, disease rates plummeted. Death from ulcers and stomach-related sicknesses disappeared, as did a string of horrible birth defects. Conception rates and litter size also increased.
Ozolac is the single most tested new product in history and is now available to you specifically so you can increase your profit potential.
Monsanto scientists took cow genes and put them into E. coli bacteria so that the bacteria produces a hormone for the cow. It's injected into cows to increase milk supply. Nicknamed crack for cows, it revs up their metabolism. Now it also produces more mastitis, a painful udder infection. So there's more pus in the milk, and more antibiotics in the milk, and more bovine growth hormone in the milk. But what's really concerning to doctors is the increase of IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1. People with high levels of IGF-1 are more inclined to get cancer. Premenopausal women with high levels of IGF-1 in their blood are 7 times more likely to develop breast cancer. Men are 4 times more likely to develop prostate cancer. And it's in much higher levels in the milk from cows treated with bovine growth hormone.
Beginning in 1994, data from the Federal Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta showed a dramatic increase in the annual incidence of milk duct tissue cancer in American women over 50 years old. The milk duct tissue cancers are among the most vigorous growing and most deadly. This increase over the ensuing 5 years resulted in a 55 to 60% increase in this type of breast cancer.
The approval process of RBGH by the FDA was highly controversial. When Canadian scientists from Health Canada reviewed how the FDA approved RBGH, they said the whole thing was a facade.
The data that we had on BGH showed enough, there was enough evidence to reject it outright. The US FDA said they didn't get the same data. Then they said they did get it, but only summary. Then they said no, they got it, the whole thing. But then they said Canadians didn't know how to apply the law. That tells you what FDA does.
Now RBGH is banned in Europe, in Japan, in Australia, and New Zealand. And now it's banned in Walmart's milk, in Starbucks, in Yoplait, in Dannon, in most American dairies. Because we've been educating consumers about the risks, especially the cancer risk. And so we've created a tipping point of consumer rejection, which is slowly kicking RBGH out of the market now.
In the end, for all these companies, it comes down to money. If they think they're going to make more money by going RBGH free, they'll go RBGH free. If they think they can get away with making more money by not, they won't. So our job is to make sure that enough people in the public find out about this, tell them about it, and say, you know, if you're going to keep using this, I don't want to buy your product. I'll just go someplace else that doesn't use it. That they understand.
I talked to a former Monsanto scientist, and it turns out that 3 of his colleagues were doing safety studies on the milk from cows treated with bovine growth hormone. But these 3 scientists found so much IGF-1 in the milk, they refused to drink milk thereafter unless it was organic. One bought his own cow.
Children are particularly more sensitive to GMOs for several reasons than adults. Number one is they have higher metabolic rates. They metabolize food quicker. They need more food. And their cells are changing quicker. They are growing rapidly. So they have a higher cell turnover. They have higher metabolic rates, higher respiratory rates, so they require more nutrition. They eat more. And number two is that children are more sensitive to smaller doses of toxins than adults. We don't respond to toxins the same way.
Their immune system is not prepared for it. They're not able to digest properly. They don't have the enzymes available to them. They don't have their gut bacteria completely developed yet.
The question of this bioaccumulation of toxins might be higher in their bodies. They have a smaller body mass. So for all those reasons, children are more susceptible.
I tell all of my pregnant women how to serve their children non-GMO food.
We have them eat non-GMO food for at least 2 weeks. At least 2 weeks before trying to conceive, preferably longer. Because we know that if mom doesn't, that any gene changes that can be passed on to the baby can be passed on to future generations, and it's a new field of genetics called epigenetics, and that's what I'm worried about. That I thought in the old genetic days, we thought that genes weren't so mutable, and we now know that's not true. That they can change expression and quickly, and it's passed on.
If the mother eats the genetically engineered foods, it is going to affect the development and the growth of her child. It's one more factor to throw into the uterine fluid that is not good, and it will cause disaster in time.
There is no pediatrician that is not going to say nursing, breastfeeding over formula. Let's be clear. So we're all breastfeeding. I've never met a pediatrician who said don't breastfeed in my career. So breastfeeding, and then again breastfeeding. Now, in certain moms, they can't. So those babies will go on formula. I say organic formula only.
I think that pretty much most all soy infant formulas are made from genetically modified soy. Which means that's a serious health hazard. The risk of allergic reactions is much too great to be feeding that to infants, especially at an early age.
Nearly all infant formulas use milk from cows injected with bovine growth hormone and derivatives of GM corn. And independent laboratory tests found significant amounts of genetically engineered soy in 4 popular soy-based infant formulas. Similac soy, 42%. Gerber Good Start Soy, 48%. Enfamil Pro Soybe, 49%. Walmart Soy, 66%. The U.S. government's WIC program provides free formula to over 2 million newborns, but only the genetically engineered varieties.
When I first discovered that GMO was in infant formula and infant food, I was outraged, honestly. I didn't know how that could have happened in this country, and I felt guilty as a mother for not knowing that it was in there and I was feeding something harmful to my child. But once I learned it was in there, it was cold turkey, just everything got thrown out, and we started from scratch.
They're really vulnerable, and we're giving their parents, before they're born, feeding them GMOs. And we know that things can get into the fetus, like Bt toxin and Roundup. And then we're feeding them infant formula with genetically engineered corn and soy, and the milk from cows injected with bovine growth hormone. What are we doing to our children?
We're just being told it's probably the best technology out there to feed the world, and that's not even true. So I'm not even sure why we have to have GMO. Doesn't make any sense.
Genetically engineered organisms are really a product to sell people. And unless there's a company trying to push a product like that and gain money, there's no point in it, because all of us can get along just fine without genetically engineered organisms. There's always a better way to achieve the same end that any genetically engineered organism is trying to do for you. There's a better way when we understand how nature does it. It's less expensive, it doesn't take so much work, and you're not destroying the environment at the same time.
I would say that we've had a huge lie perpetuated upon us by the multinational corporations, making us believe that the GMO is the way to feed the future. It is not. It is a bad idea because we don't know the adverse effects on health. It is not worth a slight increase in crop production or longevity on the shelf in order to sacrifice that for human health.
We really are at a period in human history where just because science can do something doesn't mean that science should do something.
We planted GMOs, Roundup Ready cotton in 2005, 2006, about 1,000 acres. Thought it was going to be an excellent way to remedy our high fuel costs, labor. That was before I started reading the bag on the cottonseed. There's all 7, 8 different warning labels. Don't touch it, don't put it in your mouth, don't do this, run to the doctor, call this number. And I'm sitting there thinking, what am I planting? What am I actually putting in the earth? I'm trying to save a little bit of fuel. I was adding to the problem. I was adding to this toxic recipe that is creating the need for more chemicals. I mean, that's the solution that we're throwing at all of our problems in agriculture, and we wonder why we have more problems.
The system has done a very, very good job of educating people into the need for GMO grains because we can't feed the world. It's just the opposite. I've just finished a season in my community where we're running trials and putting in test plots for corn. We're doing better than the GMOs, hands down.
The mythology that somehow the people of the world are starving because there's not enough food is very strong and has been drummed into us for 30 years now, 40 years. In fact, there's over 1.5 times more food on the planet than we need for every man, woman, and child. Even Josette Sheehan of the World Food Program admitted at the height of the food crisis that the problem wasn't lack of food. There's plenty of food. People couldn't afford it.
I was at a conference of some of the experts who actually know how to feed the world. And we had Secretary Vilsack there speak to us. And when he started talking about how GMOs could feed the world, he was actually booed and hissed by these experts.
The evidence does not exist to support the claim that GMOs are going to be the way forward to feed the world in a way that's sustainable and equitable in the future.
The world can feed itself. The world has always fed itself. The world has enough food. Due to corruption, people may not be getting food, but there's plenty of food. Monsanto's whole drive to create GMOs is a disaster in front of us now. The world can get rid of it. The world should get rid of it. The sooner the better, now.
If you give animals a choice, I know for sure they'll take the non-GMO every time.
We have a dog, a mascot dog in the office, cute little Cocker Spaniel. Her name's Chloe, and we decided, well, let's see if she can tell the difference between GMO and non-GMO. She immediately went to a pile of non-GMO corn versus the same right there next to her GMO corn, and she just tasted it, spit it out, went to the the non-GMO corn, and ate it. And Chloe does this every time. It's absolutely amazing.
I have feed that I store in my garage for my livestock. Our non-GMO feed is stored directly beside a conventional feed. We have seen where the mice, the rats, the raccoons will attack our non-GM feed and leave the GM feed untouched.
I obtained 4 or 5 cobs of genetically modified corn, took them home, threw them into my hens, which I thought they were going to eat them, but they just ran over like to eat them, but they didn't touch any of it.
I set up a feeder side by side with the regular feed store feed, and the chickens chose the non-GMO feed naturally. They emptied the feeder without touching the other one. So I refilled it, and I says, I'm going to play a trick on my birds. I flipped the 2 feeders from spot to spot, and the birds still chose the non-GMO feed, which was incredible.